What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. We discussed before how the original Game Boy console, on which the Pokémon series first found life, was not without its flaws. How could it not see some cracks on such a primitive system? But surely with the next generation of hardware, we would see marked improvements and leave behind certain issues. Well, sure, but that doesn't mean we won't find more as well. So let's take a look at the top 6 problems with Pokémon on the Game Boy Advance. Number 6. An improvement? Any game series moving to a new console is always exciting for the sheer possibilities. At least it's exciting until the game comes out and doesn't quite live up to those lofty expectations. And I will say, there are definitely some things that the third generation of Pokémon games improved upon, like... the cartridges are smaller. That's something, right? Okay, so they did add full color, which was missing from the original Game Boy, but I'm not sure that these are the right colors. They are rather muted compared to the rest of the series, and even if the games had a harder time rendering color last time, at least they popped more. Not to mention, they removed out chunks of the only new gameplay these added, with the Sevi Islands never again returning, despite revisiting Kanto multiple times since then. But there's also the other aspects like quality of life, which at best took a lateral move, but was really more of a downgrade. The Johto games gave us the day-night cycle, which was not only a great way to diversify Pokémon populations and incentivize backtracking, but was also instrumental in the evolution of certain Pokémon. This meant that in any of the main series Pokémon games for an entire generation, you couldn't get Espeon or Umbreon. They never even bothered fixing it with a stone or anything. They would rather build a whole separate game to get them instead. Granted, they did introduce things like abilities, natures, and double battles, which are a good step forward, but failing to implement something that they had in Gen 2, which had 2 regions stuffed in it, by the way, can't help but shake my confidence a little bit. Number 5. Abandoned pursuits. Perhaps this is not fair to lay at the feet of the GBA era of the franchise, but boy did they start up a ton of stuff that just did not last. As I mentioned, some battling changes have stayed to this day, but then you have things like contests and the Battle Frontier. I'm not saying those are bad. I may not personally enjoy contests as much as some others, and the appeal of the Battle Frontier still eludes me, but I do recognize that many fans adore such features. Credit where it's due, Gen 4 did endeavor to keep both of these things around, which is probably why so many people can agree that it's good, but after that we never saw them again. Correction, we saw contests only for the remake of the Hoenn games, where they also merely teased the Battle Frontier, which angered those who foolishly got their hopes up. And if we zoom out further to look at all of the Generation 3 timeline, we see all of the other branches they started that ended up going nowhere, like the Pokémon Ranger series and the story-driven side content of Colosseum. The only thing that seems to have weathered the storm is the Mystery Dungeon series as far as continuing spin-off material that started around this time. I don't know what it is about the GBA times that made the people in charge lose confidence, but they seem to really struggle in making a lasting mark on changes in the game going forward, at least outside of the battlefield. Number 4. System Overload. This one is probably more personal than anything, but I feel like there are way too many variations of the Game Boy Advance out there, needlessly so. The original GBA is a chunky block that does have some charm, but is pretty limited. But then there's also the Game Boy Advance SP, which evidently is the preferred option, since they make up about half of the sales of this Game Boy with 81 million units sold, and about 43 million of those being SPs. Which I can't really blame people for. I would probably want the 1DS option too. Then there's also the Game Boy Micro, which might just be one of the worst ideas Nintendo ever had. On paper it sounds like a Proto-Switch Lite, but in practice it removes one of the best features the Nintendo handhelds had going for them, backwards compatibility. The Advance could play the Game Boy games, the DS could play the GBA games, and the 3DS plays DS games. But the Micro could only play the Game Boy Advance games and nothing else. This would be fine, except the Advance wasn't nearly as widespread as the other systems, so maybe they should have reserved that exclusivity for something a little bit more popular. I guess they could at least watch those videos if they wanted. Number 3. You can't play them. I know I said this before about the first iteration of the Game Boy, but you really can't play these games. Granted, it's not as hard to find copies of these cartridges, and the battery loss isn't that big of a problem either, but even if you can find the physical games, it's gonna be hard to use. The Game Boy Advance hardware is not really a priority for Nintendo these days. It was included in the DS systems, which, if you're like me, means that you've held on to one and you can always play it there. But past that, with the 3DS and Switch, you can no longer play these games. This really wouldn't be that big of a problem, except that we've seen virtual releases of the original Game Boy games that can be played on these newer systems. So not only is the GBA hardware left in the dust, they don't even care to allow players to experience the stable of software either. I honestly don't get why this gap exists. They wouldn't even need to update anything. They can just do it like how the Game Boy games are played as they always were. Nintendo seems to have done this with the GameCube as well, so I don't know what it is about this specific time period they want us to forget, but since this is about Pokémon, I will simply say, it is absurd that if you've got your 3DS and your Switch, you can play literally every generation of Pokémon except for Gen 3. No wonder so many people talk about these ones on emulators, but maybe that's all for a good reason, because number 2, the Dark Ages. You'll often hear people praising Gen 1, and those that played Gen 2 love it to bits. And you'll often hear people say, Gen 4 got me back into Pokémon, or they might say that about Gen 6 or Gen 8, or maybe they even say it about Pokémon Go, but you never really hear that said about Generation 3. The fact of the matter is that Gen 3 is when a lot of the hype for Pokémon finally fell off, as kids in the first two generations grew out of it, even though there's no such thing. I'm not saying this is the Game Boy Advance's fault necessarily, but when you look at the numbers, it did sell noticeably less than its predecessor and substantially less than its successor. It's the second worst overall in sales for a debut generation, second worst for a third game, and worst selling set of remakes, period. So that probably had something to do with the overall lack of interest in the franchise. It didn't help that the show became harder to watch before that, and other contributing factors. I mentioned the poor performance of the Pokémon games for the GBA, but those are the top 3 selling spots in the system's lifetime. When the best the Game Boy Advance can do is the scraps of a series, you know that there's a severe lack of interest. And it's created a slump that has caused immeasurable setbacks in Pokémon's popularity. Seriously, just imagine how much bigger it would be today without the GBA letting the series down and sticking it into a period of prolonged Dark Ages. Number 1, you can't catch 'em all. The tagline of the franchise has long been a call to action for collecting each and every one of these little monsters. And, us being humans, the chance to collect stuff never goes to waste. So we caught 'em all, in the games, in the cards, and toys, just about any way we could get them. At least for a good 2 generations, then the Game Boy Advance came around and decided to strip Pokémon of one of its core tenets. You can catch all of the Hoenn Pokémon to your heart's content in Ruby and Sapphire, and a couple of other ones from past gens, but there's a huge chunk missing. You want a Mankey? Too bad! Hoping for a Murkrow? Get over it! The only way to access these forbidden Pokémon was to buy a whole separate game version of the Kanto remakes, and probably some Emerald too, but whatever. Sure, there were version exclusives before, and difficult one-off choices, but at least then you'll have something of equal value the other person will want in return. Here you would have to buy a completely different game just to get your foot in the door for half of these trades. Otherwise, good luck trying to convince anyone out there that they have to accept yet another Linoone for an uncommon Pokémon like your Farfetch'd. I may have had a little trouble coming up with things to talk about for the GBA era of games, largely because I barely played it, and after the fact, too. But this blatantly money-grabbing scheme of requiring multiple versions per generation may be commonplace now, but that doesn't make it any less egregious, and certainly took a toll on the Game Boy Advance time for the Pokémon franchise. So much so that they don't even really say gotta catch 'em all anymore. I bet they're having buyer's remorse on the last name for their show's protagonist, since now it's just a painful reminder of their corporate strategy undermining the dreams of children everywhere. If you like the GBA style of games, that's totally fine. They are objectively worse, being stuck in a weird middle ground, but it was a necessary step to get to the good stuff. But those are just some of my problems with the Game Boy Advance era of Pokémon. What problems do you have with the GBA? Let me know down in the comments. Also, be sure to leave a like, Share this video and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And we'll see you around next time!